Good evening. It is time for us to get started for our 2023 Martin Luther King Jr. annual lecture. We're going to start with a meditation from Dr. William Turner Jr.
Good evening, everyone. You hear me okay? Good.
Pull the mic to your right.
This right?
The other one.
This one. All right. Is that better? All right. Greetings, everyone. It is important that we never forget that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century that the black church ever produced, and shared with the world as the apostle of love and prophet of social justice. According to James Washington, despite the lofty heights King ascended in his national role as a leader for racial equity and unity, he remained close to the common folk through the regular practice of preaching practically every week. Some of his greatest sermons were delivered from the pulpit of the Ebenezer Baptist Church where he pastored. In 1963, King finally capitulated to requesters and allowed some of these sermons to be committed to text. His hesitancy to do a book of sermons were that sermons are intended to be heard, and in the Afrocentric world are co-constructed by the preacher and the community to whom the sermon is delivered. Our meditation comes from chapter 1 of The Strength to Love. The text was Matthew 10, verse 11. Be wise as a serpent, but harmless as doves. King introduces the text in the following way. A French philosopher has said, no man is strong unless he bears within his character antithesis strongly marked. The strong man holds in a living blend strongly marked opposites. The idealist is not usually realistic, and the realists are not usually idealistic. The militant are not generally known to be passive, nor the passive militant. Seldom are the humble self-assertive or the self-assertive humble. But life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites. The philosopher Hegel said that the truth is found neither in the thesis or the antithesis, but in an emergent synthesis that reconciles the two. King's challenge for his hearers is at the heart of our prayer and meditation, and challenge for those assembled in this moment in time to commemorate the life, legacy, and love of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. His challenge for us is to be tough-minded in synthesis with being tender-hearted. So we offer our hope tonight that we will be a tough-minded community, astute, firm in our purposes, solid in our commitments, and known for our incisive thinking, giving realistic appraisals and decisive judgments. And may we be resolved with our tough minds to be tempered by tenderheartedness, exemplified in genuine compassion, passionate friendship, understanding, boundless forgiveness, mercy, and unconditional love. May this commemorative lecture mark both our acknowledgement of Dr. King and others who championed social justice and the continuation of our own journey toward the beloved community. Amen.
Amen. We thank Dr. Turner for that. Now, we're still at the State University of New York, but if you feel like you're in church, I'm going to ask you to do another churchy thing and stand up while we're singing this hymn. Lift every voice and sing. All right, here we go. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven rings. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing our rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Look at y'all being good church members. Everybody sit down. My name is Douglas Thomas. I'm the chair of African and African American Studies. Now, before I go on with the occasion, I'd like to introduce my colleagues in my department. Dr. William Turner Jr. He is our critical race theorist. Dr. Michael Boston. He does African American history and African history. And our senior professor, definitely last but definitely not least, Dr. John Mara, senior scholar of African literature and an expert on Pan-African education. Today we are celebrating the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This is our signature event at the African and African American Studies Department. We've been doing it since 1985, according to the records that I have. If Dr. Mara has anything older than that, he could correct me. Because in 1985, I was 10 years old. But we are still here doing this, and we've had some very impressive speakers in the past. We had Dr. Angela Sims in 2020. We had Dr. Yolanda Pierce in 2022. In 2021, we had Dr. Eric Lewis Williams. We had Mark Lamont Hill. Just very, very excellent speakers. And I want you to know tonight that the one we have tonight, she falls right in line. She is an excellent writer. I've never heard her speak more than just hello. But she's an excellent writer. I was telling my students, you know, if you eat that rice, I like that rice, and you put that butter on top of that rice, and when that butter melts down, it gets into all the little rice, you taste it. That's the way her words work into your consciousness. And we need some of that today. I'm telling you, if I was a hoodoo man, I'd say she had a mojo. But since I'm a Christian, we say she's anointed. She got something going on. I don't know if God gave it to her or the devil, but she got something powerful in her words, and I am glad to have her amongst us tonight. The reason why we do this is to bring the great scholars, the large ideas, to a small place with people who are not small, because our students are the most important people on the face of the earth. Sometimes they forget it, but we always know. And we have this speech for them. And before I sit down, I want to thank Brockport Student Government, who helped us sponsor this, along with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you, Demita. Thank you, Felicia. And all the other people whose names I can't name. And now, I am going to stop. I'm not finished. It's just time for me to sit down. And I turn it over to our fearless leader, Dr. Heidi McPherson.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Good evening and welcome. My name is Heidi McPherson. I'm honored to serve as president of this wonderful university. I want to welcome our students, our faculty, and our staff to our wonderful Fannie Berrier Williams building, named after the first African-American graduate of SUNY Brockport. Ms. Barrier Williams was herself a pioneer of civil rights, and so it is fitting that we have our annual Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Lecture here in this building. And I also want to thank our community members who are joining us virtually tonight. As we have heard already, SUNY Brockport has been hosting this annual lecture since 1985. This is a remarkable testament to Brockport's commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Through our lecture series, we highlight Dr. King's legacy as a visionary leader who championed the values of equity, diversity, and especially inclusion, and who so steadfastly talked about the beloved community, as we heard earlier today from Dr. Turner. I want to hone in on that word community because it's our sense of community that has been so stressed and tested so much during the pandemic, and as we have grappled as a nation with clear examples of disunity and unfairness. And it is our engagement with and uplifting of a sense of community that runs throughout the university's own Better Community Statement and our vision of building meaningful lives and vibrant communities. All new students here sign a copy of our Better Community Statement at orientation and receive a challenge coin that signifies its ongoing message and direction for their time here with us. As I reflect on what Dr. King said about community, I am struck by his focus on reconciliation. He writes, "But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. And it is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. The type of love I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love, not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love that may well be salvation of our civilization. It takes a lot of hard work across our campus and our nation to strengthen our community, but each of us can commit to doing so in small and big ways every day, especially if we follow Dr. King's lead and his message. Thank you for being here today. I'm delighted to hand over to a wonderful woman president, my partner in shared governance, Felicia Amwafu-Kumi, who will introduce the speaker tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Felicia Amwafu-Kumi. I am a public health major in the class of 2023. I am the president of the Brockport Student Government, and I'm here today to introduce today's guest. Before I do, I would like to share something small about her. Dr. Imani Perry is a smart, funny, and great storyteller. She has a lot of accomplishments, which includes helping majority white population to understand some of the underlying structures of racism in our country. She has done many presentations on different campuses about identity, race, and gender. Dr. Perry is one of the nation's great public intellectuals that has many written books that has impacted many people, especially young adults. Dr. Imani Perry is a public intellectual, cultural historian, and one of the best-selling authors in the nation has. So without taking much more of your time, with a standing ovation, let us all welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Imani Perry.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for being here. Is this the one? Wait, is this the one? All right. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. It's I'm particularly moved by introductions that are not just reading bios, but actually, I just think that I'm just deeply appreciative of the time that you took to put that together. I'm also I'll just admit before I start speaking, I'm a person who really loves the discussion part, the Q&A, and so I'm always inclined to discussion. So I just wanted to say a few things because that was just a beautiful suite of comments and thoughts that were just shared. And I was thinking about, as we sang the first verse of Lift Every Voice and Sing, how often Dr. King, at the most difficult moments of the movement, in moments after people had been murdered, after the movement had been betrayed, in his speeches he would cite the second verse, and he would say, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod felt in the days when hope unborn had died." And he would go on, and it's that second verse that actually is often what is invoked in the moments of adversity, and part of the majesty of the song is that it takes you through this epic journey of Black life. And it was a sort of moment of recognition for me when I realized, sort of going back over the speeches, how often he did this, is that King understood himself as in a tradition, an extraordinary tradition, a spiritual tradition, a moral tradition, an intellectual tradition. And I also consider myself standing in that tradition, and also the one of Fanny Barrier Williams. As I was on the plane, I was thinking about her particular adversities, right? As and this story that I once read about her when she wanted to study art, and she was in Washington, D.C., and she enrolled in this art class, and the instructor only allowed her to take the class, but there had to be sheets up between her and the other pupils. And then she figured, well, she'd go to Massachusetts and try there, thinking that it wouldn't be as hostile. But there they actually put her out of the class. And this, part of what my work does is sort of is a reminder that these struggles were national, and that they required an incredible degree of fortitude and courage, both in the context of the movement, but all throughout history. Right? Simply the endeavor of attempting to be educated, to live expansive lives required extraordinary courage, and also withstanding the experience of humiliation over and over and over again. And being able to withstand it and still do extraordinary things is, I think, a part of the tradition that I think we have to hold fast to. Okay, so I want to start today. I will put my glasses on and off because I am trying to deny that I need progressives. So that's just going to happen. So when my glasses are off, I can't see y'all. When I am on, I can't see the paper. That's how it goes. So I want to start where I often begin, which is in my birthplace of Birmingham, Alabama, because it was so central to the civil rights movement, or the Southern Freedom Movement, and of course to Dr. King's legacy. And of course we're talking about the beloved community. Now, King wasn't the first person to use that concept, and Josiah Royce, who is the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, to which Dr. King belonged, developed this concept of the beloved community. And he said, the beloved community is not some vision of heaven in the clouds, but a sense of practical possibility about what human beings could create on earth, a kind of vision of eschatology of heaven on earth, an end of being in right relation to one another, in a context in which love and justice rule, right, in which people, irrespective of identity and social position, are included, right, and conflict might be solved by means other than violence. And Dr. King is the one who really not just popularizes the term, but made the language available to us for us to imagine a just future. People talk a lot about Afrofuturism today. I think in many ways the Black condition is an Afrofuturist one, because it requires that you always are imagining a future possibility that is not yet here, and that's inclusive of the prospect of the beloved community. Now, Birmingham is important in part because it is one of those places that was a stark reminder that the movement was a community movement, right? The work of many. And when Dr. King arrived, Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the local leader, made very clear to him, you're not going to come in here and run everything, right? But rather we're going to be collaborators. And the King's ability to do that Dr. King's ability to do that was extraordinary. Now, in the spring of 1963, the most sort of significant event in terms of movement in Birmingham took place. I was born 9 years later. And it was the Birmingham Children's Crusade. Right? In May of that year, 1,000 students left their classes. They gathered at 6th Street Baptist Church, Reverend Shuttlesworth Church, to march downtown. As they approached the police lines, hundreds of them were arrested. They were carried off to jail in school buses, and wagons, police wagons. Hundreds more gathered the following day for another march. Okay? And this is when you get the footage that is so, that is in some ways sort of burned into our imaginations when the white commissioner of police, Bull Connor, directed local police and fire departments to force the children to halt, right? Those are the images of the fire hoses, the children clubbed by police officers, being attacked by police dogs. And this triggered outrage throughout the world. And the thing that is important to understand is that some of these tactics were not entirely new. My mother is terrified of dogs to this day because when she was a little girl, which was long before this, she was a little girl in the 50s, and they would walk to her and her siblings. There were 12 of them ultimately. They would walk to get day-old bread once a week, and they had to walk through a white neighborhood to get there. And the folks in that neighborhood would sick their dogs on them as they walked through the neighborhood. And that terror is imprinted. So this event that the world saw and was outraged by was not wholly new. Similarly, when they used to test the limits of segregation on buses as teenagers, things could get quite terrible. She also tells a story of her and her friends leaving. Black people had to leave out of the back of the bus, and they decided to leave out of the front to push the limits of segregation. There were 5 of them. They walked out the front. The bus driver used an indelicate term for them and pulled a knife out of his pocket. He tried to stab one of the girls. One of the boys pulled her out of the way in the nick of time, and my mother says she can remember the vision of the seat, the splitting down the middle with the cut of the knife, and the girl immediately losing her memory, her sense of who she was. She couldn't recall her name or where she lived, and this was a girl who lived out in the country and didn't have a phone. And so they had to find a way to get her home. So the point I'm making, just for context, is that when the world saw these images, they were seeing a tip of the iceberg of the kind of ritualized violence and humiliation that these young people had decided that they were going to confront. Now, despite that moment of violence, the children continued to march and protest in an organizing action that is now referred to as the Children's Crusade. Right? And so Dr. King came to Birmingham and gave voice to the courage exemplified by these young people and by their families, who bundled the children up in order to prepare them for protest. Last year, I gave a talk in Birmingham, and my uncle came, my whole family came, and I told everybody, see that row of folks in the back? Those are all Perrys. And my uncle, after the talk is over, my Uncle Gene often holds forth. And there's a group of people surrounding him. I was like, oh, what's he talking about now? And I came up and he was showing this group of people a scar on his head from when he had been hit by a police officer during the Children's Crusade. And I, who have spent most of my life studying the movement, never knew that that was the source of the scar on his head. And for me, it was a really potent moment because the heroism of that period is not fully remembered. And it was not met with acclaim, although we cherish it historically. It was met with violence, as happened repeatedly, right? Part of the retaliation was, of course, for that, and also the March on Washington, was in September of that year, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 girls died in the bombing, and 2 black boys, were killed later the same day. They are not often remembered. It's also important to keep in mind that the black folks in the city were enraged. I remember watching a cable network on the day of a 55th, I can't remember, but anniversary celebration, and the pundits were saying, well, you know, what was so extraordinary, the day after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, black people in Birmingham were so peaceful. That's not true. People were enraged. Babies had been killed, right? It was a horrific event, right? And so when we think about the timeline and the challenge of the beloved community, I think we have to take heed of all that happened. We stretch out the timeline a little bit further back, right? So we're still in 1963. Earlier 1963, right? There's a lot of protest happening in Birmingham. Robert F. Kennedy, then Attorney General, asks James Baldwin to get some of his friends together, important black people, to come to the Kennedy apartment on Central Park South. And the idea is that he wants to tell them, can you get these black people in Birmingham to chill out a little bit? Because it's not really good for, party politics. And Lorraine Hansberry, who I wrote a biography of, is one of the people who comes along with Baldwin. Lena Horne is there too. It's a variety of people. And so the conversation begins sort of awkwardly, and one of the folks who's there is Jerome Smith, and Jerome Smith is a CORE member. He's a person who's an organizer in the movement in CORE, and he's up in New York from Mississippi because he has been so badly brutalized. He needs to have a very extensive eye surgery, and in that moment, it's important to keep in mind that part of what was happening for organizers there is that they were having a very difficult time getting the FBI to pay attention to the brutality that was being experienced by organizers. And so, Jerome Smith starts to talk about, the failure, right? They're sort of getting around to the conversation about, can you get sort of the people, the black folks in Birmingham, to stop being so unruly? And Jerome Smith is like, well, can you pay attention to the way that we're being brutalized? And apparently RFK is sort of dismissive and sort of turns his head back to the famous people. And this infuriates Lorraine Hansberry, who is quite famous at this moment, first black woman playwright to have a play on Broadway, et cetera, et cetera. And so she says, that's the person who you're supposed to be listening to. And then she flips the conversation and she says, rather than talking about whether or not our protest is convenient, I want to talk about, and she was referenced a photograph that had circulated of a police officer with his foot on the neck of a black woman in Alabama, and she said, As far as we are concerned, the people of Alabama speak for us, and now what we want is a moral commitment from you. Now, the press reported on this conversation. So she says that, and then they leave, right? And Baldwin says, she was tiny, but it was like she was huge in that moment. She took over the whole room, and she stands up, and they depart. And the press reports that day as a failure, the meeting as a failure. But within a few weeks, John F. Kennedy's language changes, and he begins for the first time to talk about the civil rights movement as a moral struggle in the way that Hansberry did. That spring. So then you have the March on Washington, August 16th, 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, September 15th. And then Kennedy is assassinated in November. Now, what's the point of telling this story? When we talk about the beloved community, history teaches us that that is not some sentimental claptrap or just a sort of romantic notion. There have been violent forces in opposition to the idea of the beloved community, in opposition to the idea of existing in ethical relation to one another, not only for decades, but for generations and centuries. That was 1963, and then the following spring, my family moved into a white neighborhood in Birmingham. And this is before I was born. And they moved from the area that was known as Dynamite Hill, right, because of how often racial attacks in the form of bombs were placed there. It was the neighborhood. They lived in the same neighborhood with Angela Davis and Condoleezza Rice, and they moved to this new neighborhood, Inslee. And the previous neighborhood, my mother would talk about how the men would patrol the neighborhood at night to try to protect their families from violence. Now, when they moved into Inslee, they were only the third black family on their block. Inslee was is now part of Birmingham, but it was created as a separate town that was for steel mill workers. And they had sections of town for black folks and sections of town for white folks. They moved into Inslee. It opened up. They moved into this pretty small house, yellow house, on a lovely block with trees that formed a canopy right off the freeway. And within a few years of being the third black family on the block, there was only one white man left on the block in what we now know as white flight. Now, this man, and he was there until I was a small child. He was still there. One white man left on the block. He kept a placard in front of his house that read "Zoned for Whites." Clearly that wasn't true anymore. And each morning, the boys in the neighborhood would kick down the sign on their way to school. And in the evening, he'd put it back up. And the choreography of the move towards racial justice can often feel like that choreography, right? Zone for whites, tearing it down, the signs that say for white only, and having them reestablished whenever we attend to any other matters. And I think about the sign going up. Of course, there is an alternative, right? The alternative might have been to become a good neighbor, right? To exist in beloved community. Now, the neighborhood is the neighborhood filled with wonderful people, but it is one that has suffered in many ways from the deprivation that has followed in the form of racial inequality, notwithstanding the transformations of the civil rights movement since 1964. One evidence of that is, you know how you can kind of GPS or Google Maps everything now. You can't Google Maps my neighborhood. It just the camera stops on the edge of it. Now, when they couldn't be kept out physically, black folks in the city of Birmingham, they continued to be excluded in many ways economically. And I continuously refer to it because it was a place where Dr. King grew up as an organizer. It was a place that became a signature location for the movement. It's also a place where great heartbreak occurred. The best laid hopes were met with disaster, right? And it inevitably led to something, even though there was and continue to be heartbreak and humiliation and defeat. The struggle for beloved community is humbling. It is the outstretched hand that is often slapped down at best. And there's a particular sermon that Dr. King delivered that I think is so important for thinking about the kind of humility that is essential for sustaining the commitment and being in community, notwithstanding the meanness that often proliferates in this world. It's one from late in his life. In 1968, on February 4th, 1968, Dr. King preached the drum major instinct from the pulpit of Ebenezer, 2 months before his assassination. And the sermon began with an acknowledgement that most, if not all of us, can fall prey quite easily to the desire for recognition and status. And he says, in adult, and he talks about this in youth, and he says in adult life, we still have it, and we really never get by it. We like to do something good, and we like to be praised for it. And now if you don't believe that, you just go on living life and you'll discover very soon that you like to be praised. Everybody likes it, as a matter of fact. And somehow this warm glow we feel when we are praised or when our name is in print is something of the vitamin A to our ego. Nobody is unhappy when they are praised, even if they know they don't deserve it. And even if they don't believe it. The only unhappy people about praise is when that praise is going too much towards somebody else. But everybody likes to be praised. And he describes this as a consequence of the drum major instinct. And he says, the presence of the drum major instinct is why so many people are joiners. There's some people who just join everything, and it's really a quest for attention and recognition and importance. And they give names that give them that impression. So you get your groups, and they become the grand patron and most worthy of the most worthy, etc. And he says it is the drum major impulse and longing that runs the gamut of life. And we see it everywhere, this quest for recognition, right? And then he says comes a time, though, that the drum major instinct can become destructive. And he says, if I want to move to the point of saying that if this instinct is not harnessed, it becomes a very dangerous, pernicious instinct. It can cause one's personality to become distorted. I guess that's the most damaging aspect of it, what it does to the personality. If it isn't harnessed, you will end up day in and day out trying to deal with your ego problem by boasting. Have you ever heard people that I'm sure you've met them, that really become sickening because they just sit up all the time talking about themselves? See, King was kind of relaxed in this moment. And they just boast and boast and boast, and that's the person who has not harnessed the drum major instinct. And he goes on to say that yearning to be better than others fuels injustice and inequality. And he said, do you know that a lot of the race problem grows out of the drum major instinct? A need that some people have to feel superior and to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first, right? And then conversely, he preached that when Jesus responded to the request by James and John, he didn't rebuke them for their ambition, but he taught that where greatness comes from is humble servitude. His interpretation of the teachings of Jesus was a reordering of priorities. Right? He told the disciples, okay, fine, you can feel the need to be first in something, but make that being first in love. Now, this concept of humble servitude that Dr. King spoke about was not charity. It was not engaging in some action that makes you feel superior to those you have helped. Rather, it was an understanding that character grows in humility, right? Now, remember, at the point in his life when Dr. King was delivering this speech, he was not a popular man, right? He was widely criticized. He had gone from the heights of international acclaim to accusations that he had stepped outside of his lane, right? stepped outside of your lane. You're focusing too much on international politics and poverty and not just desegregation. And yet, he remained steadfast in his commitments, and his critics weren't all coming from the other side, as it were. There were people who had criticized him, and some fairly, for his own drum major instinct. You're taking up too much space. You're not being appropriately democratic when it comes to organizing. He had been chastened by young people in the movement who had been quite effective, and certainly who as effective as his organization. Ella Baker talked about who was the person who opened the space up for SNCC to be founded because she'd been marginalized in SCLC. And she encouraged the young people to form a more democratic organization where their voices were taken seriously. Fannie Lou Hamer had also had difficulties with SCLC. The internal politics of the movement weren't always easy, and Dr. King caught some of the heat from that. He had come out of a middle-class family with great stature in Atlanta. His daddy, I think that Dr. King was one of the greatest preachers, but if you ask my mother, she said, well, he couldn't preach like his daddy. He couldn't preach like Daddy King, right? He come out of this extraordinary tradition, different circumstances than some of the poor and rural folk he worked with, and sometimes it showed. And I don't say that to tear down Dr. King, but rather to let us remember that even this extraordinary human being, one of the most extraordinary human beings in human history, was fallible because human. We all are. He'd had humbling moments. So when Dr. King talked about humble servitude, he wasn't speaking in that moment as someone who stood on a pedestal. He was speaking as someone who was experiencing humility then. Someone who had been criticized, who had been dressed down, who had been insulted, someone who had dealt with periods of deep depression when he couldn't get out of bed. Someone who had been told his tactics were wrong, someone who had lost people he loved, so many died, someone who wondered, if I had led this or that march a different way, would that person have lived? Someone who had been jailed and bombed and doubted, who still remained steadfast in his principles. Glory is a rare thing, even for a figure like that. Even for the people we know in historic reflection were undeniably glorious. Life doesn't offer much glory. It's more likely for it to offer moments of confusion, adversity, and frustration. And yet, if we want to be members of beloved communities, we are compelled to live through all of these realities and also continue to reach our hands out to one another with love and care, and that isn't easy. And so one of the questions is, well, how do we get to be the kind of people for the community we aspire to? And I want to return to the children to think about that. Now, part of what distinguished the civil rights movement from a long history of organizing and protest and advocacy that had taken place within Black communities was the role of young people. And part of what made these young people ones who could step out into the world was how they had been nurtured and raised. So the freedom movement through the 1950s was largely planned by like civic associations, local organizations, schools, churches, as well as unions, and sort of formal political organizations, both left, liberal, and moderate. Politically, as the structures through which they planned protests, boycotts, court cases. Also, so that in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision rested upon both the work of teachers and local community organizations that supported plaintiffs themselves, in addition to the NAACP. And of course, that decision led to a proliferation of other kinds of organizations because it seemed, okay, the courts are finally, after 60 years, returning to the side of equality, or beginning to. Now, people belonging to all of these organizations in service to their communities, that practice fueled a deep kind of interdependence and trust. right? And now we often say we don't have time to belong to anything, but you have to think about one of the most consistent things that researchers of joy, recognize it's critical to satisfaction in one's life is being part of a fabric of communities. And there was this intense associational life, particularly in the Black South pre-desegregation. And we have to remember that when we wonder how people who were so mistreated and oppressed who were able to fight back, and not only fight back, but also sing while doing so. Now, when the young people integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, if you know that story that is one of those curricular things that we remember, right? The mob that showed up at Central High for the Little Rock Nine. One of the things that happened when they would travel to talk about their experiences as kids is that they would enter into places that were filled with this tradition, right? A large set of community practices. So when Melba Patillo, for example, one of the Little Rock Nine, went to talk about what it was like to experience desegregation at the First Baptist Church in Little Rock, it was at the behest of the Youth Fellowship. And the Youth Fellowship had organized multiple events, and they had nurtured the identity and the mission of young people in that city in such a way that she had this kind of fortitude to enter into the space, such a horrific space. And that's how it was, right? Civic and social associations led by Black adults pursued the goal of racial justice, but something different happened in 1960. In Greensboro, North Carolina, and I'm sure you all know this story, but I'm going to repeat it to make a point. 4 North Carolina A&T students acted spontaneously, February of 1960, and these are people who had been cut and sewn in civic associations in the ritual life of schools and churches, etc. Negro History Week, as Black History Month was known back then. But they did something unprecedented, and I think of it as they took flight. They had been nurtured, and they took flight. So these 4 students sat down at a lunch counter to protest segregation. On the second day, that's February 1st, February 2nd, there were 30. February 3rd, there were 50, right? Sit-ins weren't new, right? But the time, the place, and the number in Greensboro was unprecedented, and that spontaneous energy signaled that the student movement to come was going to have a different structure. It's going to be more insurgent, more improvisational, and the youth would lead. They'd foster, new tactics, new styles of leadership. Now, by the end of that February, right, 50,000 students had conducted sit-ins and protests all over the South. Right? And these are these extraordinary moments of spontaneous moments of extraordinary transformation, but they were the outcome of the slow, humble work of service, the everyday work, as was Dr. King himself. So I'll give you another example. Many people know that Dr. King attended the illustrious Morehouse College and then went on to graduate education. But he was the product of Atlanta University in some other ways. Atlanta University had long been considered the premier Georgia Black institution when it came to classical education. They ran a laboratory school in the 1930s and 40s. They weren't the only HBCU to have a laboratory school. There was one at Virginia State, Alabama State, Tuskegee, Talladega. Among the pupils of the Atlanta University Laboratory School were Martin Luther King Jr. and his sister Christine. Their model came from John Dewey at the University of Chicago, and the curricula consisted of, quote, a unified and social problems core, with seemingly a no pre-planned structure core in the upper levels. No grades were assigned as the staff incorporated narrative assessments, a staff of 11 teachers, 200 student enrollment. It was a true experimental site, right? So a place that was actually nurturing young people to engage in social problem solving. And then his first public speech was delivered in April of 1944 when he was a kid, a young teenager, at the State Convention of the Colored Elks Club, held at the AB Church in Dublin, Georgia. Now, each local chapter of the Colored Elks Clubs would sponsor a high school student for the oratorical contest. And young King representing his father's chapter, was the winner in 1944. And those were commonplace practices in the segregated South. They were occasions to revel in the much celebrated Southern oratorical tradition and for the community to gather and nurture youth. And such contests were also a dimension of the ritual practices that entailed expectations of grace, dignity, elocution, appearance, and that fall he would go on after winning the oratorical contest, he would go on to higher education. Now that his speech topic was called The Negro and the Constitution. And the speech was both patriotic and critical. He asserted in it that if Black Americans were given the vote, quote, they will be vigilant and defend, even with their arms, the ark of federal liberty from treason and destruction by her enemies. And yet he was also damning of America's refusal to recognize the earned citizenship of Black people, saying, yes, America, you have stripped me of my garments. You have robbed me of my precious endowment. And in the midst of the speech, he makes a little reference to lift every voice and sing. And he says, on January 1st, 1863, the proclamation emancipating the slaves, which had been decreed by President Lincoln in September, took effect. Millions of Negroes faced a rising sun of a new day begun. Right? I mean, it's just the sign that he had attended ceremonies and assemblies and services where he sang this song, which was a mode of socializing him and his school members in its collective meditation on the promise of freedom and its persistent denial, right? And the point that I'm making really is that in the context of this speech, which is extraordinary for a teenager, what becomes apparent is that he had been raised in a beloved community. He spoke as the United States was fighting a war against Nazi Germany and the rise of fascism, and African Americans in the midst of that war effort were often reminded their country people that their loyalty to the nation yet and still far exceeded the nation's to them. Right? He said, so as we gird ourselves to defend democracy from foreign attack, let us see to it that increasingly at home we give fair play and free opportunity for all people. Now, obviously, he was extraordinarily gifted, but the ability to even recognize that fact in this speech is because Colored Elks Club members believed it was meaningful to have young people write essays about justice outside of school, to be celebrated, right? These are people who worked hard all week, often in degrading ways, often humiliated, and they chose to be together in loving ways, people whose neighborhoods were bombed, still baked pies. People who were called slurs and made to get on the back of the bus held talent shows. People who witnessed lynchings and survived the lynchings of family members participated in quilting circles. They served through devastation. Right? King was also young when he did his work, a young adult. Remember, he just died at just 39 years old. But he was someone who had been poured into. The adults who served him, who cultivated him, did not do so with the sure faith that he would change the world. It was unlikely. They invested, they loved deeply, they had faith in who their young people might become, with little to no evidence that the world would make space for them to be fully. And so I think of the work of serving and cultivating the beloved community today is akin to that. It is the daily work that has no surefire result, right? Through which we can't expect an outcome that will work to our personal advantage. All we can know is that it is the work of serving humanity, that love in its abundance yields beauty, even when it doesn't necessarily improve the immediate conditions of our lives. It is still good. We don't know so many of the names. We don't know the names of people who hid civil rights workers when the Klan was out trying to find them. We don't know the names of the people who fixed the cornbread and greens that the organizers ate after long hours knocking on doors, registering people to vote. We don't know the names of the people who swept up the stained glass that was blown out of the windows at 16th Street Baptist Church. We don't know the names of the people at the back of the line on Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, but no movement happens without these most humble servants. They must be acknowledged if we're going to practice in beloved community. And our task is to remember that our service matters regardless of whether or not it is acknowledged. And more than that, to love who we are not because of what others say, but because of what we know to be true. Now, it's easy to talk about a past that is generally agreed upon as noble. But the question is, what about the divisions that exist today, right? There are abundant forces that reject the idea of common respect or even basic listening. There are lots of people who once described themselves as free speech absolutists who are banning books and people and identities. But the point, I think, that is useful for us to dwell on today is that the fight for the beloved community has always been a dangerous matter, one that requires humility even when we are impassioned, right? Do you think it was easy for King to hear from people who said he took up too much space? Think it was easy to, think about what he had endured in his life to hear that. You think it was easy to recognize that people who faced the violence of the Klan alongside one another might have very different visions of what freedom would look like? We're all deeply imperfect in our visions of freedom for no other reason than the fact that we're human. It is in the doing, in the act of being in ethical relation with one another that we can even begin to approach something like right? And that requires listening. And not just that, but witnessing, meaning listening plus. Listening that entails a deep respect even without full comprehension, with an assumption that dignity is essential in everyone and must be recognized. And that doing cannot be bound up by pre-existing boxes. One of the questions I most often get today is, what do we do about all the book banning? And my answer is always, we read them anyway. We read them together. We live the society we want, right? We can't be held by the boxes that have been preordained for us. Why worry about the clothes someone wears, the pronouns someone claims, if you refuse outright those, or the markers of people's identity? What you're saying is that that person doesn't merit respect. That's anathema to the principle of beloved community. It just is. It just is. It's an ethical matter. When the phrase "I believe" becomes a tool for punishing the independent life of another, belief becomes an undemocratic principle rather than a matter of personal truth. One of the things you often hear about race today in schools, or when people study African American history, is the way you can't teach that history because it makes white kids feel bad. And I always respond, what low opinion this society has of the capacities of white children. The assumption that they cannot have expansive moral imaginations and identify with those who have been oppressed. That they can't become greater through hearing those testimonies. Why can't a white child be inspired by Frederick Douglass much in the way I, a black child, was inspired by Shakespeare? Part of what the concept of the beloved community does is make the full spectrum of human expression available to us as long as we can respect one another and care for one another. Now, I'm about to wrap up. I've been going on for a while. One of the things I have learned in the process of sharing my most recent book is that stories beget stories. So I have people coming to me constantly and they saying, well, I was talking about your book, and for the first time my grandparents told me about X, or my cousin told me about Y, or even I heard the story of my uncle's scar, right? And so what I want to leave you with as a final comment for today is a charge that in the process of committing to practicing beloved community, one shares that we all ought to sustain sharing the beauty of it in our lives, right? Not only the what, right, how we experience community, how we've experienced community, how we've built it, but the why. because values are created and cultivated and nurtured in community. And if we want to push back against those who would exclude or harm or diminish, we actually have to be gathering together ritually, closely, in ways that are both caring and sharing. I'll stop there. Thank you. You have some time to talk?
Right now we're going to do Q&A. If my fellow students would get up here with mics. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. I don't know how we'll do this with the streaming audience. Can they ask?
I can repeat
No,
it.
they can't. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, well, it should have been.
Oh, sorry. Should have been here. Yeah.
Sorry, y'all. Thank you. Don't let me forget my glasses, please. Or comments. Say, who's gonna go first? I used to be a law professor. I'll call on people. Oh. Sorry. Yes, sir.
I'm Dr. Mara with the African and African American Studies Department. You spoke eloquently about MLK's vision and practice. I am familiar with him in terms of his international connection.
Yes.
He was in Ghana when Ghana got independence, and when he came back, he gave a sermon in Georgia, and he introduced, Ghana to his audience.
Yes.
Not only Ghana, but West Africa and so forth. He did a beautiful job in terms of bringing it down to so that the people can understand. I don't know if you can make more comments on that with respect to his international experience and vision that include the continent of Africa.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. Yes. I mean, and this is actually something that I think it's really important to understand the international dimensions of the freedom movement broadly. So with King going to Ghana, right, the impact of Ghanaian independence on the Black American political imagination, also the outrage with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba actually generated after 1961 a lot more sort of protest activity amongst African Americans. And then, of course, members of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, did a tour of West and Central Africa. And then even later, when you get to the 70s, you have organizers, and I actually just got a box of documents because my parents were organizers about Southern African organizers who came to talk to people who worked in the mines, in coal mines in Alabama, to create sort of international solidarity around the conditions of miners, right? And that was long held, but that was into the 70s. I think it's real. And then there's. I'm sorry, one more thing. It's also really important to tell the history of HBCUs as international institutions, right? So, for example, Lorraine Hansberry's uncle, William Leo Hansberry, is known as the father of African studies in the United States, and he taught at Howard for years, built their African studies program. The only reason he didn't have a PhD is that he went to Harvard for graduate school. There was no one there who had the capacity to examine him, right? So he had to, they didn't know enough to know whether he merited a PhD. So he built that department and was never tenured, but was this extraordinary intellectual, wrote many books, and taught people who would become organizers in their countries of origin, including Nnamdi Azikiwe. And so, and that's it's a long who went to high school in West Virginia and worked in a coal mine when he was there, and went, and now I'm blanking on the name of the school, but a very famous HBCU in West Virginia, because so many of them had high school. So there's this extraordinary history of connection between, independence movements and the freedom movement in the United States that has been largely erased from public memory. one question, I mean, so of course, part of my interest is, well, we have to tell it, but also why? You know, what is the political backstory to an effort to cut off the story of liberation movements for Black Americans from the rest of the world, right? And that has multiple dimensions. There's also an effort, and I think a mainstream discourse to cut off the story of labor movements in Black American life from the civil rights movement, right? And so, as expansive as this history is, the way that it is taught to us is fairly disgraceful, and also I think actually contracts the sense of possibility and what to struggle for today, right? Yeah, so thank you for that. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Esther. I'm a freshman here, and I would just like to know, like, how did you come about researching about the Black American history, or like, did your parents like influence you to doing this? Because during the Fannie Barrier Williams renaming, it was very impressive, and I would like to say that your presentation was also impressive. So like, I would like to like know if you have like any like advice for future generations who would like to do things like this.
Thank you for that question. I have an ancestor who was named Esther. She was born in 1769 in Maryland, so I'm moved by your name. I actually have two ancestors named Esther, both born in the 18th century. But so my parents were organizers, and my mother in particular had been raised with, before Black History Month, it was Negro History Week. So she had been raised, all of my family had been raised with this sense that you're supposed to know your history, right? And so it was sort of, in some ways, it was organic, but it was also, I was a reader young, and I came of age. I was born in 72. The 1980s was this extraordinary period of Black women's writing. And so there were so many books that were coming out. And so part of the passion was just, as I love to read, and I think, I'm always telling young people that reading is a muscle, that, because it's hard, we didn't have internet, we had 3 TV stations. So it was easier to spend all day reading because there weren't other things. And I think there's lots of ways to acquire knowledge. So I think documentaries and even podcasts. But there's something about reading as a kind of vocation of life that I think is really important, and to do it in a ritual way. And I think it fosters the imagination and creativity. And so. I also think it's really important to think of it as a lifelong endeavor. We're lifelong learners, right? It's not, most of what we learn doesn't happen in the years we're in college, if we go to college, right? And we all know people who have not gone to college who are extraordinarily brilliant, right? And that is it is evidence of a lifelong commitment to learning, right? And so I think it's to have a sense of the disposition that you want to knowing about the world, as opposed to, everybody should be goal-oriented. I'm not saying you shouldn't be goal-oriented, but the learning stuff is it's not quick, and as you learn, you're like, oh, okay, well, I like that word. I'm going to incorporate that, or I like that concept, and it becomes part of who you are, right? And then you share it, right? And I think that's the biggest part, because as you acquire knowledge and you share and you're getting, and then people do that for you, and then you what you know kind of accumulates, and you develop this sort of relationship to people. Although my friends make fun of me because they're always like, okay, here she goes again. I'll be like, did you know? And then they go, yeah. But yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question. Yes. Oh, they want you to use the mic.
This isn't a question, but it's more of a comment.
Yeah.
I said that although we don't know the names, I like and personally appreciate the credit that you gave to the people who stayed behind or stayed to cook the food, sweep the glass, and I believe you said standing at the back.
Yeah.
Because to me, they are little sparks of motivation that gets overlooked due to them not playing a big part. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I learned that from, thank you so much for that. Bob Moses, who was known as the person who organized Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, when these college students came down to Mississippi to support voter registration drives, and really sort of is a really important moment in the movement. He used to always, when I was growing up, he used to always point attention. He would always say, well, he would say, when we got down to Mississippi, we didn't know anything. We would have all died. We would have all been killed if it weren't for the people who were already there, who had laid the foundation. And so he's really a person who taught me that, right? And he's a person who has celebrated people, but he'd always, and he'd remind some of his friends of that too, who would say, we did this, we did that. And he'd be like, well, you wouldn't have been able to do that, right? If someone hadn't told you, don't drive down that dirt road. And I think, I think it's especially important for those of us who have access to higher education to keep that in mind too, right? Because that's another piece of it. The reason we get to sit in these buildings is because there are folks who have done so much for that to be possible, who don't get to sit in these buildings. Yeah, so thank you.
Oh, I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I thank you, Dr. Imani Perry, for everything you've done. You're wonderful. God bless you. I want you to talk a little bit about, let me preface my comment by saying that I grew up in the South under the shadow of all of that, the trauma, the types of things you talked about, with your uncle. My grandfather was a preacher. He made a comment about the civil rights movement, a favorable comment in his Sunday night broadcast, and he got beat up the next morning. Mm-hmm. They caught him, beat him. And I just found out why. My mother always told me the story, but her brother told me this is why, because of what he said in that Sunday night broadcast. And I got a lot more stories like that. They just go so far back. I want you to talk a little bit about how you move. Well, let me add another thing. I do African history. I intentionally steered away from African American history because it was too traumatic for me. Mm-hmm. And I get to African history, and then I see colonization. I say, oh, that's bad. I go back. Mm-hmm. Then I see the slave trade. Oh, well, that's bad. And what do we go back to? So I just have to face the trauma. Now, I want you to tell me, big sis, how to move through the world as a scholar, knowing all of this, because the knowledge is a burden, mm-hmm. and deal with the trauma.
I mean, there's a piece of it that is so personal, right? My grandmother taught me how to value small pleasures. She liked straws, and a corner of cornbread. And she would eat on saucers, right? And for me, and this, I feel like this is a thing that it's very hard for Americans in general to talk about, but Black Americans really need to know this, right? Life is, we do know, but to actually really know, life is just hard. It's just hard. And you have this vision often when you're young that you're going to get to some place and it's just going to be steady. And even the most beautiful moments often have big tragedy in the midst of them. And so part of my relationship to the history and reckoning with the trauma is in some ways the question of life, right? In the sense that when I see, this is going to be a little bit inchoate, but it's such an important question. So I listen to music every single day, right? And when I hear the music, right, of our tradition, and we dance and figure out and laugh, right, the laughter, right? It is actually, to me, the sort of most extraordinary achievement of what human beings can do, right? In the face of that, to be able to sing and laugh hard and dance is actually kind of mastery of the difficulty of the human condition in a way that so part of the drive is to show that, to tell that story, right? What does that mean? How great the spirit is, right? And so I guess that's what I hold on to that, and I hold on to the rituals. I had this realization the other day. I was like, remember all those, I was talking to my son, I said, remember, you know the stereotypes they used to tell all the time, about black folks, they laugh and they do all this stuff, and they just want to hang out with each other. And now all the research is showing that that's actually how you live a good quality of life and not accumulation of possessions. And right. So it's like, okay, back then it was seen as sort of a deficiency. And now, oh, wait, we know how to do that stuff that you say makes a good life quite well. So I think it's a question of what it takes to, at a personal level, to manage it, and also stepping away. And but I think joy as a daily habit is so important. And it's hard for scholars and also students to recognize. It's so important. You don't put off joy, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. Right? So you have to do joyful things, I think, every single day. Every day. Something sweet and lovely every day.
Thank you for your presentation. And I respect the fact that you have a lot of great knowledge on Dr. King, and you also have oral historical knowledge that's been passed down from your family. When I think of Dr. King, I think people have him locked in that I have a dream mode, and I don't think people know that he was a brilliant man, and he was constantly making transitions in his mentality. And you spoke of the beloved community. Can you talk about, Dr. King in terms of him advancing beyond that I have a dream mode, and where he was going mentally with his thoughts to fit in the beloved community after, say, 1965, up until 68 when he was assassinated?
Yeah, I mean, I think even the I Have a Dream speech, the part that we hear quoted is very different from the part that is about, is the broken promise part of the speech. It sounds like a reparations speech. Most of that speech, right? This nation owes a debt to black people, right? But King is, and really in many ways all the way through, right? So he focuses, he's organizing specifically on this question of the structure of Jim Crow. But Dr. King was an anti-colonialist. He was an anti-imperialist. He was critical of militarism. He was focused on question of poverty. Asked this question: what does it mean to be integrated into a burning house? Right? Talked about Chicago and said, well, the white folks in Chicago could teach the folks in Alabama a thing or two about racism. I mean, he was critical of the national project and international project of white supremacy. And this is part of why he was not only, it was just so deep, so he's thoroughly reviled by white Americans when he dies. I mean, he just was. And then even the sort of revision of that history is a part of the lie. So that part, but then also there are people who were sort of mainstream in the movement who were like, you gotta chill. Like, what are you talking about, all this other stuff? We were talking about integration. Like, what are you doing, right? Talking about independence of people and talking about, that the war in Vietnam is unjust. Like, that was Roy Wilkins' response. And then you have the young people who are like, and stop with this nonviolent stuff, right? And so he's getting it from every angle, but he was a really sophisticated thinker about the question of justice, and didn't have he didn't have ideological limits to asking the question. And I think that for me is the model, right? And I keep saying, I keep realizing when I look at these historic figures and they'll say things and I'm like, I don't agree with that, or I don't agree with that, but I'm like, but if they provide a model, that the model of how to think, the model of how to struggle, it doesn't really matter that they may not have been where I take myself to be, because they have modeled for me how to think through the positions that I want to embrace today, right? And so, I think it's a really important point. He was as serious an intellectual as he was an organizer. They were totally intertwined, yeah.
I just wanted to know whether you could name or identify those who argued that Dr. King took up too much space, and what were exactly the argument?
Ella Baker. Yeah, she said that he wouldn't let her speak or actually sort of fully participate in SCLC as a woman. March on Washington, no women speak. There's all these women organizers. When SCLC came down to came to Selma, SNCC had been organizing, and they were like, "Kids, you gotta move over. This is our show." Right? And they had been the young people had been there on the ground, right? Like up all night where they couldn't sleep because there were people shooting in their windows, and they said, "Move over," right? So that's just a few. After 1964, the MFDP at the Democratic Party convention, when Fannie Lou Hamer was chosen by SNCC, you're going to be the spokesperson here, because they had the freedom vote. SCLC, and so that was sort of a potential shifting moment for the Democratic Party, and they sort of moved in to marginalize the largely agricultural working poor folks who had been central organizers, and said, no, we want the sort of political elite class of black folks to become those who are the voices in the Democratic Party as it's expanding. So there were many, many instances. And he was also extraordinary, right? I think the reality is both things are true, both things are true.
Dr. Perry, thank you for your talk tonight. I especially appreciate this idea around Ella Baker. It's something that we interrogate in our institutional racism class as we look at the civil rights movement. I have a mug on my desk from my students that says, 2 things can be true.
Yes.
And so we dealing with this race, but we're oppressing in terms of gender these great minds and organizer. Ella Baker in her own right is undervalued in her significance,
yes,
as you talk about. Here's my question though. What does the beloved community have to do with anti-racism today?
Do you want me to get in trouble? Is
Yes,
that what you're
please.
Okay, so here's what I'll say. I was in a meeting not long ago, and I wound up saying to my fellow people in the meeting who were talking about their anti-racist work, and I said, you're exhausting, because all we're doing is talking about your angst and your struggles. And sometimes I think what would be more useful then that conversation is actually focusing on sharing power and teaching everybody's stories. And what I'm not opposed. I will say I went to an elementary school in the 80s not marketed, that's not the right word. It was a Quaker school, defined itself as an anti-racist institution back then. So I'm very familiar with this language. And I think that it's a good thing to aspire to, is that we're not racist. But I think ultimately the question has to be, but is power being shared, right? Is it actually the case? Or I'll give another example. My child graduated, so it's okay. But at his high school, they had an award ceremony for the social justice awards, and all the people who won the awards for anti-racism were white girls. And I said, this is sort of in a context where there were plenty of black kids experiencing racism on a regular basis. And I said, there's something awry with the way that the project is rolling out. So it's fine, but the beloved community asks us not to perform in ways that absolve us of being accountable for racism. Like, I'm not, because I'm doing these things. It actually asks us to be together and be together in ways that are funky often and uncomfortable and difficult, and actually have to come back to the meeting after the moment that was difficult. Right, have to come back to the table. It is not allyship because it's actually your community, right? It's not being an ally, it's your struggle too, right? And so I am frustrated. I'm frustrated with the language, I'm frustrating with the consulting structure, right? I'm frustrated, and I'm always hesitant because I don't want to seem like I'm trying to kick people for trying, but I do want to say repeatedly that procedures aren't it. And so much of it is procedures. I'm going to do this procedure of absolution, right? And that's not the same thing of actually creating community. I mean, the number of times where you notice, folks will proclaim commitment to these principles, but really will not share power. That to me is the red flag. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I got.
All right, we have time for one more question. Come on. Who is it?
Leave him alone. Hi, my question actually is similar to what the Esther behind me asked about advice for the students. And given your study and looking at SNCC and the Little Rock Nine and the college students from North Carolina A&T who sat at the Woolworth counter in Greensboro, what lessons from that history do you think would be helpful for our students today, who many of whom get easily offended by what I would consider, like, you're mad about that? Like, there could have been much worse things said to you. Yeah. Look at the history of these young people. Yeah. So what can students today, young folks today who want to be activists, who want to be part of the beloved community, what advice could they learn or get from that history?
Yeah, and I have such conflicting feelings about this, because just that point you made, because I often find myself rolling my eyes, but this is not the point, right? What people are offended by. But then on the other hand, I'm like, I love how much young people are not willing to they're not going to cede an inch. Like, they're like, actually, if you want me, you have to take all of me. Right? And there's something beautiful about that, right? So I guess I don't want them to lose that, but I do think it's important to, one, keep in mind that, struggle has to be sustained. These things are not a season. They are often, if you talk, I love that I have, there's so many folks from SNCC around, and if you guys go to the SNCC Legacy Project online, there's so many of them are still organizing. They love talking to young people. That you learn, it's lifelong work, and that losing battles as part of lifelong work, right? That you have to sustain. Much of the work that they did was different in that there weren't cameras coming like all the time, and there wasn't a professionalization of being an organizer in the way that we're like people will. I mean, I just remember in the context of Black Lives Matter, you know, people organizing, then almost immediately foundations are swooping down and choosing the stars and putting a lot of money, and it leads to conflict and all. They didn't have that dynamic, and I think sort of it's part of why organizations are so important that are not personality driven, right? But I think it's understanding that it's slow work. And that battles can be relevant even if you don't win, and important because you're also becoming, like you're creating yourself in the process. It's not, you know, you want specific things to happen and hopefully they will, but also you're becoming a person who has a kind of knowledge and integrity and power, right? And that's in and of itself really meaningful. And I think the other thing is that it doesn't take a lot of people to make a significant amount of change as sort of, you know, I think, you know, when if a part of the problem of always showing the March on Washington is that people think that that's most of the protests or actions or marches were maybe a couple hundred people. They weren't that, right? You know what I mean? So, yeah, but I the last thing I'll say, I know we're out of time, but I really, and I say this to my kids and my students, you really do have to curate your life. And I mean that not just like, you know, figure out what your favorite shows are, but that's a piece of it. But like, you know, there's so much that's coming at you constantly. We're in a hyper media world. We're constantly being inundated, and you have to make choices that are very deliberate about what you're taking in, because all of that shapes who you will be and become, right? And so if you want to be someone who's really knowledgeable about X or Y, or who has a deep understanding, you actually have to make choices, you know, that guide you in that direction, and you have to make them repeatedly. Like, this is not one documentary a semester, you know. It's like sort of and to be thoughtful, how am I spending my time? Who am I spending my time with? What are we talking about? What am I listening to? What am I watching? What am I hearing? Most of it is not in the classroom, right? So thank y'all so much.
Well, that was wonderful.
I did okay?
Yes.
I was all right?
You did all right. Dr. Perry will be signing books.
Yes.
I won't sign my face.
Okay.
And the books are for sale out back. They ain't free. Girl, you better go on somewhere. You the one that got all that money. You.